All right, we'll get going here. All right, so today I picked a topic I think is pretty interesting, and I was reading on this guy wrote this article that is pretty fascinating, and it basically is about the ability to predict life outcome based on like data gathering from childhood. So there's this perception, I think, in the social sciences that if you give me enough data, I'll be able to predict anything. And there was a huge study that went on. It was like a very large longitudinal study of, cross-sectionally, where they studied, thousands of families for decades. And then they drew a lot of conclusions from it based off of that data that was collected and then how the people turned out. And they came up with all kinds of things like, some of the obvious ones were like, if you're coming from a rich family or a more affluent area, you're much more likely to have successful adult career and be more financially well off. If you come from a family of drug addicts, you're more likely to be a drug addict. There was things like that were kind of like, well, yeah, no kidding. Thanks for wasting all that money and time studying something that was just plain and obvious to everyone. But there was a whole bunch of other data points that were gathered associated with this thing that people tried to use to draw other conclusions and also to set policy making. And there are a lot of implications to using statistical models on policy making. So when you use a generalized statistical model and you take specific data points from someone and you decide whether or not to provide services based on those data points, you could potentially be mistreating someone or shorting them of some service that they should be getting, or giving service to somebody that shouldn't be getting it based off of a poorly designed model, basically. And this is somewhat of a sensitive topic, especially in liberal circles, because the idea is that like you don't want to deny services to people that need it, and on the conservative side, it's sensitive because you don't want to provide services to individuals based on some arbitrary, what seems to them arbitrary, distinction. So either way, it's controversial to use statistical models in general or any type of designation to decide policymaking and allocation of governmental services or taxes. So this article was kind of fascinating to me because it basically, this guy, Bill Voorhees, he's an editor at Data Science Central. He dug into this analysis that this group did, where they took that same data set or a very similar one that was a very huge longitudinal study, and they collaborated with 160 teams that were statistical statisticians to develop models to predict various outcomes in people's lives based off of the data. And the interesting part about it is that they just sucked at it. Like they weren't really able to predict anything with any sort of reliable consistency that would say, okay, so if this happens to you in your childhood, or you come from this background, you definitely have a disadvantage in X. So we should provide Y service. And it was one of the interesting kind of points that they made is that while the models weren't very good at predicting, future outcome for any individual, they were very good at predicting what the other models would say. So they were a better indicator of what each other would predict than they were of predicting the specific state that the individuals would end up in. The short version is you can't use statistical models to determine how to treat an individual in a group, regardless of what you think about that individual. And there's just too many factors going on that determine success and failure in various things. and the technology is just, the data gathering isn't there. Any questions or commentary yet? Yeah, all right. So this study itself wasn't so much a study of the individuals or a study of like the broad ranging demographic outcomes. It was more a study of the ability of social scientists to actually do predictive behavior. And the short version is they're terrible at it. They weren't actually able to predict a whole heck of a lot when it came to like outcomes for individuals. And the takeaway from the study from the researchers here was it shouldn't, these sorts of studies and these sorts of like information should not be used for policy making, is the short version. Because anybody who, from a social science perspective comes in and says, all right, here's a disadvantaged group and this is how we solve this disadvantage, is their model and their how they've come to that conclusion is questionable at best. And it was scientifically studied how accurate in general these social scientists can be, and the short version is they're not very accurate. So it kind of blows a hole in a lot of the arguments around policy setting based on social science. Now, does that mean we shouldn't do any of this stuff and shouldn't study any of it? I don't think that's really the conclusion they come to here. But they basically say it just from a scientific perspective, and whether or not we should make this, far-reaching economic or social decisions based off of these kinds of studies, the answer was like pretty resounding no. Yeah. And I kind of summed it up right here in the significance. It basically just says none of the predictions were very accurate. And you can see some of the general, the core motherly survey, the primary caregiver survey, the core father survey, in-home assessment survey. So these are, data sources from various different other perspectives, right? So what does the mother think? What does the primary caregiver think? What does the father think? Third-party in-home assessment. And then once you get to age 9 and 15, they start asking the kids. So they basically aggregated and normalized all this data into a data set structure that was, consistent, so that then they could apply various statistical measures to it. This guy, this predictability of life outcomes, study, which is what this one is, that is basically studying the ability of social scientists to do predictive analysis, was pretty critical of the overall. It was very critical of the overall ability of social scientists to predict. But this guy makes some good points here. The risk of models. We all need to remember this was the good point that this guy was making in his write-up, his analysis of this study. Getting much above 80% accuracy is pretty rare, right? So that means when you develop a model and you get within 60, 70%, I mean, 50% is a coin flip. You're basically guessing, right? So to say that, 80% accuracy is good is a bit of a stretch, right? You're still, potentially discounting or leaving out 20% of, people that should have been included. So, I mean, just the standard for scientific accuracy in the social science realm is like really, really terrible. In comparison, like in physics, they want like 99.997, or else they reject the null hypothesis. So it's just a completely different world and set of standards. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it other than this. Yeah, so
Maybe.
these guys are trying to find a way to improve social policy. That's what they're trying to accomplish. Sorry, go ahead, Roxanne.
I was thinking about this whole, predicting life outcome and behaviors, and I don't think that's entirely possible. Maybe you can predict specific things, but you have to take into account the fact that we're, human beings and we interact with different types of people. So those people do end up affecting us in a good way or a bad way. So maybe this is why you cannot really predict such things. My personal opinion, at least.
Yeah, I mean, it breaks down when you start to do the individual predictions. You can predict, like these kinds of studies are good for predicting group behavior, right? So like if you look at the general economic projection for people in urban settings versus rural settings, you can generally project what somebody's average income is going to be based off of the region that they live in. But what you can't do is pick an individual out of that group and say John Smith from 5-6 Mulberry Lane's income will be X, because there's just too much variability associated with the individual that completely destroys the ability to predict. It works the same way in sports betting too. Everybody always wants to come up with this model to predict the Super Bowl, and it's the same kind of thing. You can make a general prediction and say it's going to be, the team with the, teams with higher level of, ground game and yardage per game have a 85% chance of winning. But when it comes to the individual game that they play, you're not going to get any definitive, there's always the chance that some guy comes out of nowhere that you weren't predicting, or their star running back gets injured the day before the game. There's no way to predict that. So there's just too much variability when you get into individual instances of anything that you're trying to predict.
Yeah, when you get into, individual stuff, yeah. But if you're saying that this applies to like large groups of people, it also has to take into account the fact that, again, people can be easily influenced. I mean, there have been um, uh, experiments, if I can call them like that, with people, I don't know, waiting in line at the doctor's office, and somebody came and decided all of a sudden that they just want to sit up each time the nurse got out and called somebody's name. And then basically everybody that was waiting in line started doing the same thing. So basically,
I saw that same exact study. That's a classic. It's pretty funny.
yeah. So we can be easily manipulated, basically. So yeah, if we are shown that something is the norm, we're going to start doing it.
Yep. Yeah. So the other thing that was interesting is that they used, R squared, which is a measure of how much of the variability can you predict with your model, is what the teams were scored on. And then also mean squared error, which is just how far from, what's the average error that your model has on any given prediction, kind of like summed and squared. So this article, and I like this actually is very relevant for our current state of everything. Our new model outlines a few possible scenarios. This is the best case scenario. This one is not so great. You can see the chart's kind of like going up, and then scenario 3 would be really bad, where it like spikes up. And then there's scenario 4, which we think is a graphing area, which is evidently circling backwards in time. You definitely want to avoid that one. If you guys don't ever look at XKCD, you should. It's a great comic.
Just one comment here. I just there is I was just watching a documentary about um, one of these survivors in Europe of one of those, it was just a young African kid who just jumped in and, along with some others, to try to look for a better future over in Europe. And he did it twice. He survived the capsize of the first ship he was into, because he was, these are not really ships. These are just, a bunch of barrels put together with a rope to try to get to the place. And the first boat he was in, everybody died. And the second boat, he was successful and he got to Europe. Now, if I'm pretty sure that if we put them under the statistics, he should have been dead by now. But the kid turned out to be savvy, and now he has some
We're
business
lucky.
going, and he has an enterprise now. And he was coming in, and I saw him in a talk speaking about how life changes and how the endurance of human life. So if and that's where I want to go with this, to bring this up, as to say that in the case of human beings, we're so resilient that pigeonholes as a number in some statistics might not be the way to go. As you were mentioning, that for social studies, these kinds of things might not be the most adequate tool to use. Um, uh,
Yeah,
and that,
it's one
yeah,
of those better than nothing kind of tools, I think is the
uh,
general attitude.
and then to make an example that we all know, take a look at Steve Jobs. If we put them under the statistics, Steve Jobs shouldn't have been what he was. He should have been a failure, and who knows what. But there he is. He became one of the greatest entrepreneurs that we have had around. Likewise, if you look at the lives of things like that, people like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, all these guys, you will see that they don't fit this pattern. They're more like outliers. So, but then if we are going to start making policies out of these kinds of statistical things, I think that we will end up missing out. The world would end up missing out with particular points, particular numbers that could have been, but since we put them or pigeonhole them as to one statistical outcome, uh,
Yeah, I mean
things work out.
that's the argument, right? Is that if Bill Gates had been statistically, Bill Gates was completely outside of the norm of like business, right? If you look in the 90s, Microsoft completely exploded, right, and took over everything, and it had the largest growth and the largest market share, and just generally just destroyed everybody. The interesting thing about that is there was a chart which I've long since lost that basically showed the network of board of directors between the Fortune 500 companies. And it had links between each one of the board members that sat on multiple boards. So like most board members in a Fortune 500 sit on the board of 3 to 5, 3 to 7 actually, other companies. So they'll sit on like the board of Boeing, but they'll also be on the board for Citigroup, right? And the board for, M3. So they'll be on like 3 or more board of directors. And so this chart had every board of directors for the Fortune 500, and there was about, I'd say 5,000 or 10,000. It was several thousand, but not like an insane amount of people that basically made up all the board of directors on all the Fortune 500 back in the 90s. It was a pretty fascinating chart to look at because you could see the interconnections between all these companies from a board of directors perspective, anyways. And the one company that was not connected to any other company was Microsoft. All of its board of directors were only on the Microsoft board of directors. And they were just like this little island all by themselves out in the side. And if you remember back in the 90s, they were like the evil empire that everybody was out to get. And you've seen that happen repeatedly with these tech companies where like they end up being on the outside and they're not part of like the core established business, ecosystem. And that's why they end up being disruptors. Now that has long since changed, right? So Bill Gates isn't the CEO anymore, and the company has been, sold and, reorganized and changed. So if you go and look at the board of directors now on the Microsoft, it's very interconnected with every other organization, and probably, and I haven't looked at this kind of like chart in a long time, but I would venture to guess that most of the tech companies out of San Francisco are very networked from a board of directors perspective. But your point kind of stands, Simon, in the fact that if they had used the standard model for allocation of resources, so like lending money, right? If a bank had used the standard model that they had and say, listen, I need people that are connected, I need people with experience, I need people that were whatever, right? Bill Gates never would have been given the cash necessary to get Microsoft to the level that it was. Now, it also helped that, software in general is a low barrier to entry. Anybody can sit down if they have a computer and they have access to the software, write a new application. And it also helped that he was a visionary and wrote some pretty cool stuff. But the point stands, right, that he still needed a bunch of capital, and if these companies had used their standard models, he never would have got off the ground. Same thing for Apple. But yeah, statistical models have massive flaws.
Well, I would say it's, and I go back again. It might have massive flaws, but I think it's a tool, and it depends on how you use it. And
Yeah,
and what, as we can see, you just said it, for social things, it might not be the most adequate, because what ends up happening is that you uh, you have so many, and with the social sciences in general, you're dealing with human beings, and you're getting so many outliers out there when you're looking at the data, that if you say, okay, you know what, let's take these outliers and let's work with this, you cannot do that, because just for starters, let's say, okay, let's work with the population, but let's take the 5% that have all the money here, let's take them away from that. It's like, what, they're not humans? I mean, you're not going to consider them, but they are. You have to put them in as part of the bucket, but then your results are going to be skewed.
Yep.
And
so
you can't
that
do
actually leads into this next article that this same guy wrote, which is why I pulled it up here, which is specifically around the ethics of and the morality of basically letting the machine decide. And the kind of basically what he says is that, the good news is that the models are going to get better, and we're going to get, we're going to have fewer mistakes. The bad news is that, there's this inclination to let the machine decide, because people have this inherent trust that machines are more accurate and more consistent. The problem with that is that if you had taken an inconsistent model and you apply it to the decision-making process, what happens over time, and I know we've talked about this on here before, is that if you don't just trust the model or trust the machine, what ends up happening over time is it's like a self-reinforcing prophecy, a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the model accuracy will go up, because every time you accept the accuracy of that model, it reinforces that the model was accurate. Does that make sense? So what ends up happening over time is that of course the model seems like it's doing a great job, is because everybody just believes it and trusts it. So that can have some pretty serious implications for any sort of policy making. So if you decide that, people with brown hair aren't as successful at business, and so they shouldn't get as many loans, of course you're not going to give them as many loans, at which point they're not going to be as successful as business because they didn't get as many loans. You follow me?
Yeah. There's also and in psychology they looked at this as well. If you look at you ever read about the marshmallow test?
Oh yeah.
So that was used. That was like some huge long study, which is very interesting. And also the work of Angela Duckworth, she's from University of Pennsylvania, and she's written extensively about grit and how all this other stuff, background, your parents' wealth or lack thereof, doesn't really matter. It comes down to the individual's grit and their ability to persevere through, difficult times.
Difficult situations, yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually one of everyone, when you look at giftedness, everyone thinks, well, people with really high IQs are going to be very successful. But actually, in some cases, the opposite is true. You get someone who's very intelligent and they go through school and everything is super easy, right? Because they're just so much smarter than their peers. They don't work, they don't do homework, they ace every test. And then they get out into the real world and they actually have something that's really challenging. Well, they never built up any grit. So as soon as they hit something that's challenging and hard, they immediately quit. They're like, "Poof, I'm done. This is
Yeah,
what do
they
you
move
mean I
back
can't?"
into something else that's a little bit
Right.
more easy for them to digest, and they stick to their safe
Yep.
places.
Exactly. Whereas you get that kid who struggled through school and they just built up this amazing muscle for just persevering and pushing through stuff. And then
So
they get
my
to the
yeah.
workplace and they're like, "Oh,
So my wife is a theater art person. I know you can relate to this, Adam. So my
I
wife is
can."
more of an art and theater person, and the arts are very collaborative just by nature. It's how can we accomplish this goal and put on this production together, and we all have to collaborate and blah 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 blah, right? And I definitely have my art side to me, but I'm much more on the engineering and on the sports competition side. And the debate that we're constantly having is around, um, the value proposition for that, right? So what I constantly am arguing, or exactly what you're saying, is that the sports teach you to get outside your comfort zone, become comfortable with failure, and to develop that grit that, failure is okay. You pull the trigger again, not to sound like I drink too much Kool-Aid, but celebrate mistakes, right? And get out there and give it another shot. And I don't feel, and the debate we are constantly having is, I don't feel that necessarily a theater production provides that same sort of like feedback. There's a lot of like patting each other on the back and, yeah, good job. There's some feedback, especially in the specific settings, but it's not like in sports where immediately like that you lost. Right. So and I'm not necessarily advocating that one is superior to the other. Just the values and the lessons that are learned there are very, very different from each other. I think most people tend towards one or the other. They have very rarely do you find people that are cross-sectional. So yeah, I
Well,
love the idea of it as an
com-
indicator of success, potential success.
competitiveness is a property of any endeavor. We cannot just say that because you're sports or your arts. I've seen it firsthand how competitive in the arts world things can be and how tough they can get.
Yeah,
And
that's right. You're a
and
musician too, aren't you?
yes, and that's why I know I will immediately dismiss someone. I said like, no, this guy cannot improvise. And what's worst, I've seen teachers tell children, you know what? Please take a bat and go and play baseball because for the piano you are not made of.
That's
And
terrible. Who would
yeah,
say that to a child?
I can honestly tell you, I've seen it with some friends. I said, no, I don't. I tried to play the piano until the teacher told me to be better. I was better as a baseball guy, so that's why I never went back to music. And it's painful, but it happens. And what I'm trying to say is that in that sense, just because you might see something happening, you might not. We cannot just make the conclusion. Oh, you know what? In arts, people are not they don't have tough skin. But believe me, they have as tough skin as any sports or any endeavor. It doesn't have to be just. Um,
Yeah, I mean, you
uh,
have to be, the guys who are successful in the arts, I'd say, are probably the ones that are very comfortable with rejection. Like, you go to 100 auditions and you get the green light on maybe three, right? It's pretty brutal.
there is a
Uh,
very annual competition being done in Russia about pianists and classical pianists, and I
if
don't
you
remember
don't
the
win,
name
they
of
take
the
your fingers, right?
doc.
That's like the one.
Oh, no, that one, not that one. I wasn't talking about that
Oh,
one.
that's a different one. That's a different one.
No, but I remember having seen a documentary back in the 90s about that competition in Russia and the candidates that go for the prize and the amount of, I mean, the struggle, I mean, it's as passionate as any sports event, as any wrestling match you can see, because the way these guys have to practice hour after hours, they just wake up and and you see them, they're having breakfast and you see them with their hands tapping on the table, and you see them just all of a sudden going back to a score. Oh, how is that? Because the competition is so tough, and only out of I think it's 150 candidates, only one makes it. And I'm talking about the top pianists around the world, the top classical pianists around the world. I remember, I forgot the name of the contest, but it will come to me. And as I was saying, all, I believe me, all tasks have these types of properties where competition and who is the best and who has the knack. That happens everywhere. So, um,
This is the
but
guy I was
again,
thinking of when you were talking about that, Adam, about the smartest guy. Intelligence not being a measure of success or future success. I remember this story of this guy, Yong Yong, who was like, the highest IQ, whatever, prodigy, and he was like working at NASA at 8 years old, and just ridiculous, right? But then he ended up basically moving back to South Korea and then just becoming a relatively humble civil engineer with his PhD. And he just basically burned himself. He basically burned out. And while, arguably still very successful, right? He's got a PhD in civil engineering and he's a successful guy. He's no Einstein, right? He didn't discover some, actual, fundamental societal shaking equation or discovery that, changed how we all live. Yeah. This guy's a very famous example of what you're talking about. There's a couple
now
of people on this
sometimes
list I was a
that
little
could be,
surprised by, to be honest. Like I
yeah,
didn't think Neil deGrasse Tyson would be on this list.
well, think about this, and just entertain this idea for a second. What if your purpose, and you're so egotistical that your purpose is not to create anything for humanity, but to just better yourself and be happy about who you are and your surroundings, who you're with your family, and so on? Why would you want to leave something for humanity? Because that's the thing. That's how we're looking at it.
Yeah, we're
We're
getting a little
looking at,
philosophical now, but it's really, how do you gauge success in life? And people that are
well,
fairly spiritual
exactly,
would consider that, spiritual enlightenment or whatever success versus people in
exactly.
intellectual.
That's
Yeah, there's
why, you
very,
know, we
very
need to
differing
take it, yeah,
opinions.
we need to take it openly, and we
Yeah.
can say, oh, okay, this guy never amount to anything. Well, that's what you're saying, because he didn't amount to anything for humanity. He didn't give
Well,
anything
he didn't
out to the
amount to
world.
anything in the realm of science and
Yes,
intelligence, is
yes,
what I would think.
he didn't provide a legacy for the science, but
But
you
but
know,
maybe he
but
had 15 kids and they're all the best kids in the planet.
maybe he loved his family, and he said, you know what, I don't, because that's what happened to a scientist, an Italian born scientist that went here in the United States, and he was doing some great research, and then all of a sudden he got lost in, he went in, and then all of a sudden he traveled to Italy, and then all of a sudden they lost track of him. Where is he? But he was gone, and he was
There's a
gone.
million there's a million movies made on that subject, right? The guy
Yeah,
who all of a sudden has a realization that he's been wasting his whole life, right?
and exactly, but he doesn't mean anything. It just means that that's how we as human beings are.
So to get back to the data science side of this, right? So planning for moral artificial general intelligence. So this subject we're talking about, where you take a statistical model developed by social scientists and then you try to generate policy making at the governmental level to decide how, a country's resources are allocated to people, right? So you say, this is a disadvantaged population and they should get X amount of dollars because for whatever service, because of their disadvantage in this way or whatever, right? Doesn't really take into account the low accuracy levels of those models and also the implications, the moral implications of it are somewhat questionable. It also has really strong implications for artificial general intelligence, which is like a general, this is what people want to think of when they talk about artificial intelligence. They think it's a robot who can talk and make decisions and act like a human being. But the meaning of that is that, people are going to make decisions, and artificial general intelligence would make decisions that don't necessarily take into account the individuals involved in the situation. And this is honestly a very common criticism of any person that's in a leadership role, right? Well, that guy didn't take into account the fact that, this specific role has this specific impact on the organization, or that this specific person contributes this specific thing to the organization. They didn't take that into account. And it's one of those things where even though the models aren't that great and the decisions are not the most accurate in the world, you still have to make a decision, unfortunately. So what does this mean for making like an artificial general intelligence that's moral? What it means is it's going to be incredibly difficult, but you still have to basically draw lines in the sand on how those decisions are made. And you have to come up with hard lines that won't get crossed, right? So the obvious solution, and I read this in another article somewhere. So the obvious solution that a statistical model, if developed, if you plug all the factors, the known factors into environmental problems and pollution into a statistical model, you very easily find that the biggest variable that impacts the amount of pollution in an environment is the number of people in the environment, right? If you were to plug that into an artificial general intelligence and essentially say, okay, solve to reduce pollution, the immediate solution it's going to come up with, if not given parameters, is, well, you simply have to reduce the population. And you've seen that in a million sci-fi movies where the equation, the AI decides to reduce war by eliminating all the people involved in the war. So it's such a simple answer to the problem that it reaches the conclusion. And unless you put parameters around them to say this is a line you can't cross, killing people is off the table, then it's a very easy solution to that problem. The problem with that, if you can write that into a machine and say, listen, you can't kill people, right? That's off the table. It's not off the table for people, though, unfortunately, and that's been seen throughout history repeatedly. They want to solve a problem, and the biggest factor involving it is the number of people. So, pretty simple solution, let's reduce the people. So AI is basically prone to have the exact same moral problem, basically. So you have to, and I'm not going to read all the details here, but basically the short version is you have to put hard parameters around these model that you develop, because if you don't, they will find solutions to your problem that are like wholesale unacceptable to you. So it's a lot of questions associated with that. And it goes into
something has
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this pandemic has shown is that it's not just eliminating the people, it's just stopping them from continuing what they're doing right now. Because as you can see, when we just stopped and we just were quarantined, the planet had a little bit of a breathing ground, but that's something that we then learn and we can add to the machine and to the model.
Yeah, it's the difference between this model-free versus model-based. So right. Model-based is giving it parameters that say you have to understand what's going on before you jump to conclusions and decide what the outcome is. And the model-free methodology is, listen, I'm going to give you the data and I'll tell you what outcome I need, and then you figure it out. You don't have to understand what's going on. I just need a solution. right? That's how this model-free approach in statistical model development is how you end up with solutions like kill everyone, right?
Right. Right.
So you have to mix the two, right? So if you stick to a purely model-based approach, you may never actually get a conclusion and make a decision, right? If you say that the social science model or the predictions are not high enough, they're not accurate enough for us to actually make a decision, then you will never do things like allocate the resources out to people. At some point, you have to actually make a decision and pull the trigger on how you're gonna, what policy is the organization going to follow. So you have to make decisions with somewhat questionable models, but you still have to make a decision. Versus the model-free approach, which essentially says, which is on the far extreme, which says that I don't care how it works. It doesn't matter what the specifics are or how it impacts the individuals. I just want a decision. And it comes up a way to optimize the whole, which is basically like reducing the standard error. Right? You have a very, very narrow definition of success. And anybody who's like working on statistical model development, or even is basically reading articles in the news around predictive forecasting and model development, needs to understand that this is when they're talking about science, this is really what they're talking about. And you'll see on the liberal news, they have a tendency to go very much towards this model-based approach. And on the conservative side, it tends to be much more towards the model-free approach. I'm generalizing, obviously, but there's definitely a philosophical tendency on the liberal side to overanalyze things, and a philosophical leaning on the conservative side to not care about the implications towards the individual or the parameters involved, and just get a solution, regardless of how you get there. It's pretty fascinating.
Yep, absolutely.
I don't know. I strongly suggest anybody who's interested in this stuff learn a little bit more about how these are both action-oriented statistical models. So there's an action that comes out the far side of this. Most people, when they think about statistics, they're thinking about descriptive statistics, like what percentage of whatever is A or B. These end up being much more on the action-oriented. Listen, we have the data represented. We have a general idea of what we know and what we don't know. Now I need to take an action. What is that action going to be? So if you get a chance, feel free to read this. It's pretty interesting article.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Keith.
I love this Data Science Central. They always have good content. They're a little controversial because the owner is the guy who owns this site basically fabricated authors to make it look like there was female contributors at one point, and there wasn't. It was kind of shady, but regardless, the content is still good. And this guy Bill Voorhees is real, as far as I can tell. Any other comments or questions? There's not a whole lot of us today, so.
In the meantime, we have to rely on the census, right?
Talk about a useless data set. I filled out the census data this year, and I thought to myself, what could this possibly be used for other than just determining like the number of representatives? And even that, I don't think it's particularly good, because I could easily have made up about 20 names and put them on the list.
Yeah, it was something like the greatest tragedy that ever occurred in America was when the IRS started requiring Social Security numbers to report children. As soon as they did that, suddenly something like 200,000 people suddenly disappeared.
Yeah, there was so they thought, the argument is obviously those people never actually existed.
Exactly. Yeah, people are just making up kids. Like, yeah, I have 4 children.
Yeah.
Like, oh, social security numbers? I have 2
I get a
children.
tax rebate of $600 per kid. Well, then I have 7 children.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
They're so much more affordable when they don't eat
Yeah.
or need food.
I actually was doing the ancestry.com thing and tracing back some of my stuff, and I found my grandfather in like Western Kansas or whatever. And the interesting thing is he came from a family of 9, and then the census data showed that he moved out of his parents' house and lived in a bar at the age of 9, and then moved to Denver, Colorado at the age of 11 by himself and started a business. I'm like, Jesus Christ.
Wow, that's
My
great.
grandfather was a maniac.
He was a Rolling Stone at a young age.
Yeah. It's like 1920 or whatever. This guy's like going from Western Kansas. I don't know if you've ever been in Western Kansas or Eastern Colorado, but there's nothing there. It's a desert, basically. So to go from that is pretty impressive. So yeah, that's the only time census data has been moderately interesting to me. Yeah, so they did a data cleanup in China. So there was an article that kind of like floated around, and I think most people dismissed it, but that 20 million people is the actual number of killed in China from COVID, and like that floated around, I think, in the media for a little bit, and they were like, wow, 20 million people are actually the real number in China. And I think the CIA leaked that or something, but the real explanation behind all that basically amounted to the fact that as part of the monitoring program in China, they installed that app on everybody's phone that allows them to track where people have gone and what they've done and who they've interacted with, to try to see where the points of contact for spreading coronavirus or any other disease for that matter are at. And in the process of doing that installation, that forced installation on everybody's phone, whether they want it or not, they basically had to audit the telecom databases to find all the phones. And in the process of doing that, they decommissioned 20 million phone records that were not valid phones anymore. And I think that the media picked that up and thought, oh, 20 million people disappeared in China. It's like, no, not really. 20 million phone records disappeared in China. And I, most companies have a ton of customers on their roster that are not legitimate customers anymore. So I suspect more likely they just did a data cleanup. So that was kind of an interesting thing to get the perspective of a couple different people online on the data science and the data integrity people. But I did find it interesting that like CNN ran an article about that, and then they didn't talk about the potential that it was just a data cleanup. They just assumed that they jumped from 20 million phones decommissioned in China to 20 million people died. I was like, wow, that's quite the leap in logic there, buddy.
Yeah, basically, if you think about it, people could have just actually even changed cell phone providers or changed their number.
Yeah, I mean, most likely it was some
or people didn't want the software on their phones and they were like, I'm done. So
yeah, or they just had their phone off and
or they couldn't pay
rejected
their bill.
installation. Or they couldn't pay their bill. Yeah, there's a million reasons. Actually, 20 million reasons why people would.
Yeah. That don't involve death.
That don't involve death. Maybe some of them are death, right? Maybe 100,000, 200,000. Who knows? But
well, I mean,
mostly probably just cleaning up data. I mean, we have a fairly controlled data set when we do clinical trials, and even on ours, we end up doing hundreds or thousands of data updates and fixes on every single data set, and that's on a fairly clean data set. Roxana can probably tell us about the 30-something thousand changes we had to do for a recent study, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's extremely fun, you can imagine.
All right. Well, I don't have anything else. I thought that was some interesting articles worth talking about. And you guys don't have anything else?
Thank you, Keith. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Keith.
It's wonderful. Thank
Good
you.
discussion.
Yep, I enjoyed talking about it, guys, and thanks for joining. Everybody have a good day.
Yep. Have a
Bye.
nice weekend.
Bye, guys.